Reverend Julie Woodson had really hoped that this Christmas Eve she wouldn't have to be a TV evangelist, or what was probably more accurate these days, an online evangelist. When Reverend Julie Woodson was studying at theological college, she had sometimes imagined herself as a TV evangelist. She had imagined millions of people turning in to watch her, tuning in to see her smile, her perfect smile, tuning in to hang on her every word about the love of God, tuning in order to get tuned into God's Spirit in their lives. But of course, Reverend Julie had only been imagining. She had never really wanted to be a TV evangelist. What she had wanted was to serve in a congregation, in a community, where she could get to know people, get to know faces and names and life stories, get to baptize babies, bless marriages, get to sit with people as they grieved, get to visit people in hospitals, get to lead worship on a Sunday morning when she could look out and see faces she knew, look out on a Sunday morning knowing that she would see familiar faces of familiar people sitting in their familiar pews. But then the COVID-19 pandemic had arrived. For long months, they had not been able to visit or even to gather in the sanctuary for worship. And so Reverend Julie, like so many of her colleagues in ministry, had become a TV evangelist. Okay, not really a TV evangelist. But Reverend Julie, like other ministers, had accepted that the internet, not the sanctuary, had to be, at least temporarily, the place for people to meet. So she'd begun to record sermons. She had preached to a camera located above her laptop screen. She had recorded her weekly reflection, then watched it, wondering if she had smiled enough, frowning when she realized she had stood too close to the camera and cut off the top of her head. Or she had reached the end of the recording time and her finger had not found the stop button as quickly as she had wanted. So for what was only a few seconds, but what seemed to be as long as a boring meeting, the camera caught her staring into it as her fingers began to move and more emphatically push at the wrong screen icon. Not really a TV evangelist, she thought. During this pandemic, Reverend Julie had learned about programs and platforms she hadn't previously known existed. She had learned how to download and upload videos, how to share screens, how to schedule an online meeting, and other skills that she was sure that Jesus' original disciples had never learned. But then again, Reverend Julie had never learned how to turn water into wine. Reverend Julie knew that her pandemic experience of technology was not unique. She constantly marveled and offered prayers of thanksgiving for the community's music team, who seemed to maintain enthusiasm and humor and devotion while weekly creating videos, playing, singing hymns, recording, editing, and again, downloading. When did that word become part of everyday language? And then there were all the people who would never have watched a TV evangelist, people who had embraced the needed adjustments, who actually inexplicably looked forward to opening a weekly email, to reading about the life of the church, to clicking on links to YouTube videos of music, and to Reverend Julie's recorded reflections. There were all those people who used to think Zoom was the sound a fancy sports car made, and now they were Zoomers, worshiping and meeting as community online. Well, there were glitches. Occasionally, someone's finger accidentally brushed against the screen in the wrong place and ended up unsubscribing themselves from receiving the church's weekly emails. Then would come the phone call or the email and process of resubscribing. Reverend Julie smiled as she thought that resubscribing was a contemporary example of what John the Baptizer called repentance. Resubscribing, repenting, undoing actions taken and turning again to a practice of God's presence in the world. Reverend Julie realized that was probably a stretch, but she had been preaching to her own image on a laptop for over a year, so she figured she could cut herself some theological slack. About 2 months ago, they had begun gathering again in person for Sunday morning worship. They had planned to gather this evening, this Christmas Eve. Some would have gathered in the sanctuary, some would have watched the service via a Zoom link. But that wasn't happening now. Just hours ago, the council executive had met via conference call to make the difficult decision to cancel the in-person service due to the Omicron variant that was spreading rapidly. Reverend Julie had received emails from several other congregations saying they had also just decided to cancel their Christmas Eve in-person services. So once again, Reverend Julie would be Reverend Julie, the TV evangelist, trying to say something about this birth, this life of Jesus, this good news of God in the world that had a hold on all of our hearts and imaginations and hopes for this world, saying something of the gift of this holy night, the gift of God's love for all creation. Once again, the online evangelist. Now, although Reverend Julie did not consider herself to be technologically sophisticated this week, she had experienced a moment of technological victory. It had occurred on the day she'd been in the church office to receive donations being dropped off for the community Christmas hampers. She'd been sitting at the office desk when the door opened and one of the staff from the upstairs nursery had looked in and asked, "Is your phone working? Our phone upstairs isn't working." Reverend Julie glanced at the display window of the phone on the desk, the display window that should be illuminated and be displaying digits and words, should be. But now it was a blank screen. "Our phone doesn't appear to be working either," Reverend Julie replied. Reverend Julie sat there for a few moments, looking at the phone, praying, if thinking, what do I do over and over again could be considered praying. And then it came to her. She could use her cell phone to phone Maurice. Maurice was a member of their building and property team, and he had been the one to set up their current phone and internet system, thought that led Reverend Julie to try accessing the internet on her phone. Her worst fear was realized there was no internet service. She was aware this was not actually her worst fear, but she suspected that in this day and age, it would probably rate in her top 20. Maurice assured Reverend Julie that he would walk her through what needed to be done to fix the situation. He told her to go to the basement, into the mechanical storage room near the kitchen, the room usually referred to as the old elevator room, because it was the room that had been accessed to service the old elevator, but the old elevator no longer existed, having been replaced in the church renovations with what was now known as the new elevator. Reverend Julie thought that someday no one would even remember there had been an old elevator. The room was narrow, felt cramped. Maurice directed Reverend Julie to a series of shelves near the back of what was known as the old elevator room. He asked if she could see what looked like a computer tower sitting on the lower shelf. Reverend Julie looked. There was a computer tower sitting on the lower shelf. She figured that must be the thing that looked like a computer tower. Maurice told her to look at the black box sitting on top of the tower and see if there was a light on. There wasn't. Maurice directed Reverend Julie to press a button on the black box. The button was black. It was a black button on a black box. Reverend Julie was momentarily thankful for having recently upgraded her glasses prescription. She pressed the black button. No light appeared. "Okay," said Maurice, "do you see the black box sitting on the shelf near the tower and the black box that is on top of the tower?" Reverend Julie thought, why are all these boxes black? Wouldn't it be more aesthetically pleasing if they came in a variety of colors? And wouldn't it be easier to distinguish one black box from another black box if one black box was yellow? Maurice asked Reverend Julie to press a button on the front of the second black box. Not unexpectedly, the button was black. Reverend Julie pressed the button. Suddenly, a small screen lit up on this black box. Reverend Julie felt a wave of exaltation. "Hold the button for a couple of seconds, then release it," Maurice's voice instructed. Reverend Julie released the button, looked at the beautifully lit screen, and then saw the lit screen go blank and unlit. When she told Maurice what had happened, he commented, "Obviously, something isn't working." Obviously, Reverend Julie thought to herself. Maurice explained that Reverend Julie would have to get a power bar and then unplug every cord going into the back of the second black box, and then plug all those cords into the new power source. "Phone me back if it doesn't work," Maurice said. Reverend Julie contorted her body to attempt looking at the back of the black box. There appeared to be about 6 black cords plugged into the back of the black box, which had about 6 inches of clearance from the wall. Reverend Julie became aware of the cramped space. She became aware that she had to perform a technical feat of rewiring based on verbal instructions received from afar. Suddenly, Reverend Julie thought of that scene in the movie Apollo 13 when the CO2 filter in the space cabin malfunctioned and Tom Hanks, Kevin Bacon, Bill Paxton had to use duct tape and the covers ripped off technical manners to create a new filter, and they had to do it by following voice instructions relayed from some technical person on Earth. Okay, thought Reverend Julie, this is my Tom Hanks moment. She went upstairs to the office supply room, returning moments later with a power bar and a long extension cord, which she was pleased to note was orange, not black. Feeling her pulse slightly increase, Reverend Julie reached behind the black box and by touch began pulling black cords out of the black box. She hoped what she was doing wouldn't cause the space capsule she was in to go spinning into space. She briefly imagined people on the International Space Station looking out a portal and saying, "That looks like an old elevator room floating around out there." Reverend Julie plugged the cords into the power bar. She then looked around the old elevator room for a wall socket, only to discover that any wall sockets in the room were already in use. No problem, she thought. This is why I brought the orange extension cord. Reverend Julie plugged the power cord into the extension cord, then unwound the cord, left the old elevator room into the lower hall. There she plugged the extension cord into an outlet in the hall. She looked at the orange cord now trailing along the floor of the hall and under the door of the elevator room. But what happens if someone unplugs this cord from the socket in the hall, she wondered. Reverend Julie suddenly experienced a moment of irrational concern. If someone unplugs this cord, disaster will follow. The phones will go down, the internet will be lost, the church roof will begin to leak, Tom Hanks and his crew will be lost in space, the second coming of Christ may begin. Breathe, breathe, Reverend Julie told herself. All I have to do is attach a note to the cord saying, "Do not unplug." She returned to the old elevator room. This was the moment of truth. She turned on the power bar. She looked at the black box on top of the computer tower. The black box now displayed an illuminated green light. Reverend Julie heard the whir of something mechanical coming to life. She raised her eyes to the top shelf, where she now saw several little green lights shining amidst a conglomerate of cords and wires. She pushed the power bar button on the computer tower. It also came alive. Reverend Julie hurried back to the office. She looked at the phone. Its screen was now illuminated. She lifted the receiver to hear the welcome sound of a dial tone. She opened her laptop, pressed a few keys. Her laptop was again connected to the internet. She had done it. She texted Maurice. She was tempted to say, "Tom Hanks and crew can breathe again." But she settled for, "It worked." Later in the day, as Reverend Julie thought about a message for Christmas Eve, she thought about those cords being unplugged and then plugged into an alternate power source. We just had to change the power source, she thought. That's what we've been doing for worship during COVID, she thought. We were used to gathering in the sanctuary on Sunday morning, but when we couldn't do that, when we had to unplug from sanctuary worship, we had to connect in a different way with emails, recorded postings, phone calls, Zoom gatherings, mailed newsletters. Maybe that's what the story of the birth of Jesus is. Maybe that's why we return to it every year, to return to an alternate source of power, an alternate story about this world. We return to this story in order to unplug from the story of powerful weapons systems, unplug from economic systems and practices that leave millions hungry and desperate, unplug from indifference, unplug from despair, and plug into an alternate story. Story with angels and shepherds and the manger and the baby. Plug into a story about God who created this world, about God who loves this world, about God who reminds us that every child of God is to be loved. A story about God who in this Jesus will break bread and share food so that all can be fed. A story about this Jesus who will welcome the poor and those who limp and who can't see, those bound by fear and anxiety. A story about Jesus who welcomes those whom no one else will welcome or even notice. Jesus who reminds us that we are loved and that God is still creating God's world to be a home of peace and compassion. That is the story of this Christmas Eve, the story of the world realigning itself with the power of God's love, the source of all life. It's a story that assures us that even in difficult times, even in these difficult times, we live in God's love. It's a story, thought Reverend Julie, for TV evangelists and technological novices. It's a story for all the world. A story for all the world on this silent, this holy night.